Hi there and welcome to Project Hospital. In this series, I'm putting real healthcare planning and guidelines into the design of my hospital and seeing how that fares against the game mechanics. In today's episode, I'm building the entire second floor. So that includes the two outpatient departments I had left. So cardiology and neurology, and I'm finally getting to some of the inpatient facilities, so the diagnostics rooms and the operating theatres, so that gets rather exciting. So the game has had an update since my last episode, and that's great because it's addressed some of the issues that I had in some of my previous builds that I've been able to address in this episode. The biggest update in the patch that's changed how I've built some things is the shared workspaces. You now have some rooms that are same as they always were, so like you have dedicated doctor's offices for specific departments, but there is a new option now for shared rooms for things like the staff rooms and the toilets. This is an interesting development, since it felt quite unnatural to me to segregate everyone for these sort of things anyway. I'm not entirely sure how it all works, since I've not got this hospital up and running yet. My intention with this hospital was always to build everything first, and then just press play and see what happens. So there might be some initial chaos if when I press play they're not sharing these spaces like I expected. One of the other updates in this patch was that you can now edit where the ambulance parking and drop-off zone is. I kind of wish this had come out before I started building this hospital, because that was one of my early criticisms in this build. I did manage to make it work though, so it's not worth me going back and redoing all this for the current build. Anyway, back to the build. So this part here, I'm working on building both the cardiology unit and the neurology unit in one go. I would have loved to have gotten the outpatient parts of these units on the ground floor, but we just really ran out of space on the last build with that one. I mean, it would have been ideal to have them on the ground floor, but it's not unheard of to have some of the outpatient units on higher floors. They just tend to cluster them all together so that you've only got people that are in the hospital for outpatient facilities being in the outpatient facilities part of the hospital. Basically, it's a case of keeping outpatients separate from patients that have been hospitalised at all times if you can. I've also gone with the split reception idea on these two departments as well, kind of like I did with some of them on the ground floor as well. I really like this kind of layout because it makes great use of the space, plenty of visibility. Also, it means that the receptionists aren't working in isolation. I feel like it's important not to have them working in isolation if I can help it. A good thing up here on the second floor as well is the luxury of space. I was really struggling to fit everything in on the ground floor, and I think in some ways I probably not followed my own rules as well as I could have done to try and squeeze everything in down there. In hindsight, it may have made more sense to dedicate the ground floor to the emergency room department, clinical laboratories and radiology, then have this floor dedicated to all the other outpatient departments. This section here, I've moved on to some of the inpatient rooms, so the examination, diagnostic and treatment rooms. 6 of the inpatient departments have these rooms, and I decided to split these from their respective departments and cluster them all together as inpatient facilities. This is so that the flow of patients to these rooms is more logical, and it keeps inpatient facilities completely separate from the outpatient offices. I think how the game works, it's only patients that have been admitted to the hospital for further treatment will be accessing these rooms, so it makes sense to me to have them separated. I was kind of hoping these would act as a shared resource for all departments with the recent update, but they're still grouped as needing their own room for their respective department. For the sonography and cardiography rooms, I've only added one each of these for each department. I'm hoping that will be enough to cope with demand, otherwise this might be a bottleneck for further treatment. For the diagnostic rooms, there's 2 each of these for each department. For the doctors who will be treating patients in these rooms, I've put the doctors' offices right next to the treatment rooms. In real life, they wouldn't be so close. These types of offices would be a lot more spaced out and they'd all be clustered together somewhere in the hospital. However, I know how the game runs and I don't want to be creating a massive bottleneck from having the doctors spending all of their time walking back and forth to the treatment rooms to their desk and back again. Having these closer will speed up the diagnosis process. The doctor's offices here, I've grouped all the departments together in the same office. I think that works okay. although the office is a little bit sparse, and it would be nice to have just one central printer for all the doctors to use instead of having to put a printer on every other desk. The corridor system around this part of the hospital will link up with the inpatients wards. That'll connect directly to the elevators around this part of the building. The way I've closed off certain corridors, and hoping this means outpatients and general access ways around the hospital will avoid these routes. I've got a similar system set up that takes patients through to the operating theatres, which brings us nicely into building the operating theatres. Now, with the game update, you can create shared operating theatres that are used by all departments. I've chosen to ignore this and set up a separate theatre for each department that needs one. That's because I felt in general each department will likely need their own operating room, so putting 5 of these into my hospital doesn't feel unrealistic. I've kept the operating theatres as isolated as they can be for infection prevention and control purposes. Each of these rooms has a separate corridor that connects to the area where the clinicians will scrub up for surgery, and then you have the theatre itself. Looking back on this bit, I could do with adding an extra door there, so that after scrubbing up the clinicians don't need to go back into that corridor to get to the operation part of the unit. One good thing the game's added here is the requirement for the scrubbing up area inside the operating theatre itself. That forces you to make a separate scrubbing up area in all of the theatres themselves. I think without that requirement, if say the scrubbing up room was a separate room, then people would be more likely to have one scrubbing up room that would be completely separate from the operating theatres, which I don't think is realistic. Now, I know while I'm playing this game, I do have a tendency to squeeze stuff into the smallest space possible, but I've actually given myself plenty of room for the theatres. That's because they are quite big. There's a lot of space given around the operating table because you're going to have a lot of clinicians squeezed into that space potentially. The colour scheme I've gone with in this room is also obviously white because that will show up if there's any dirt or grime that needs cleaning up after every operation. Also, definitely no external windows because that just adds to the cleaning regime. And the windows I do have in there, that's floor to ceiling so that it's easier to clean. Where I've had a choice, I've also gone with the grey colours and the metallic schemes. Everything would be stainless steel because that's more difficult for bugs to take hold onto those surfaces. Something else I've got set up here, in this section of the hospital, I've also set up dedicated cleaning closets for each department. My hope is that janitors work in these closets keep close by to the theatres to clean up whatever messes happen in there as soon as the operations are complete. I think something I'll be looking out for once I press the play button is that these areas are cleaned before every operation, because that would definitely happen in real life. As I did with the doctor's offices before being close to the diagnostic rooms, in the operating theatres section, I've also set up the doctor's offices close by here, so doctors will be readily available to spring into action as soon as patients are brought through. Same with the nurses station here too. If I'm able to dedicate doctors to only performing operations, this section of the hospital should run really smoothly. And that's pretty much the second floor complete. There's not much more to do, just the inpatient wards and the intensive care unit on the upper floors. One thing I wanted to do in this episode though, I had a comment back last week asking if I'd do an overview of the hospital so far with the walls down, so that people can get a better view of the setup, so I'll run through that now. Okay, so this is the accident and emergency department. The reception and main waiting room are over here, and over in the corner here you have the doctor's offices. The other side of the unit over here is dedicated to the more serious cases, so you've got the trauma unit just up here, and this is directly adjacent to 2 4-bed observation wards. Next to the emergency department is radiology. Now this has its own separate entrance from the emergency rooms, so patients that are coming from those rooms don't have to mingle with patients from outpatient departments. The rest of the ground floor is dedicated to outpatient clinical rooms for general surgery, internal medicine and orthopaedics, and all the associated staff rooms, cleaning rooms, waiting rooms, corridor space that goes with all of that. Oh, and of course the clinical laboratories are on the ground floor as well. I don't think I've given the clinical laboratories enough room that they do need here. We might start seeing problems when we press the play button because there's going to be a bottleneck at the labs. So up into the second floor, which we've just built, first off we have the cardiology unit and the neurology unit. Next to that, I have a separate space dedicated to all of the inpatient examination, minor procedures and diagnostics rooms. As I said before, these rooms I've grouped by what the room does, rather than the department that the room is for. Now, up here in this corner, I've put in here quite a large restroom, which, looking at it now, it's far too big, it doesn't really fit here very well. I have to change that. So, a couple of staff rooms around here, and that extra diagnostics unit I've put in up here. I don't really like mixing clinical space with some of the staff facilities, but sometimes like here it's kind of inevitable. Hopefully these shared staff rooms work well, otherwise we might be in trouble once we press play. I've added a little stretcher storage space here because, knowing from previous playthroughs of this game, you kind of run out of stretchers quickly. That brings us to the separate operating theatres unit. This has direct access from these elevators that will connect with both the trauma unit on the ground floor and the inpatient wards and intensive care unit on the upper floors. Quite a hefty amount of space dedicated for the theatres, but I think that's justified. And that's where we're up to so far with this build. Join me next time when I'll complete the build with the inpatient wards and the intensive care unit on the upper floors. I hope you're enjoying the series. Leave a comment and let me know what you think or what you'd do differently. Liking and subbing also really help the channel and keep me motivated to make more of this madness. Anyway, thanks for watching, bye for now.